There are literally no true crime cases that aren't terrifying, and certainly no serial killer and serial rapist stories that aren't terrifying. But this week we're going to cover a story of a man who is perhaps even more terrifying than almost any other. The monster at the center of this case was in a very powerful position in Canada, and he had even rubbed elbows on numerous occasions with dignitaries from this country and from around the world. Not only that, but it has been proven that he is not a psychopath, but rather a man with a very powerful sexual deviance coupled with a lack of empathy for his victims. He committed his crimes, but he was also able to control his urges so that he would not be detected. That was until he made a mistake. Hello, my name is Lance, and I again have Bailey with me in the co-host chair. Welcome to episode 156 of Gone But Never Forgotten, the life and crimes of former Colonel Russell Williams. Hello, Bailey. I and the listeners are all lucky to have you 2 weeks in a row this week. We decided to do 2 episodes instead of one marathon, so thank you for spending this time with me on 2 episodes this time around.
Hey, GBNF crew. I'm glad to be covering a home case and covering yet another episode with you, Lance. Every time we get together, it seems like I'm expanding my knowledge and learning more and more about some cases that I've either touched on or heard on in the past, this being one of them. Though I am happy to be covering something that finally is Canadian, I am nervous to essentially be doing a cover of your wife's case. It's some pretty big shoes to fill, so hopefully I do it some justice.
It's okay. I've talked to Julie about the fact that we were redoing this, and we kind of skimmed a lot in terms of what was done in this case, and I feel like you and I have covered some pretty gruesome crimes in the past, so there is a little bit more detail that we're going to get into, and I felt it was appropriate with the time of year, with November 11th literally a week from now. So I feel like this is one of those cases that I do want to put back out there and kind of put a little bit more, I don't want to say shine, but a little bit more attention on just how disgusting of a human being this was and how high-ranking he was in this country.
It really is terrifying how high-ranking this man is. So let's dive into the life and times and crimes of David Russell Williams, shall we?
David Russell Williams was born on March 7th of 1963 in Bromsgrove, Worcestershire, England, to his parents Christine Noni and Cedric David Williams. His family would later immigrate to Canada, and they settled in Chalk River, Ontario. Cedric was hired as a metallurgist at Chalk River Laboratories, which was a Canadian nuclear research laboratory.
After their relocation, the Williams family befriended another family, the Savka family. Christine and Cedric would ultimately divorce when Williams was only 6 years old, and his mother remarried to friend Dr. Jerry Savka. During this period of his life, Williams did take on his stepfather's name, and he moved again, this time to Scarborough, Ontario, a suburb of Toronto.
While living in the Scarborough Bluffs area of Scarborough, Williams attended Birchmount Collegiate. While he was in high school, he delivered newspapers for the Globe and Mail, and he learned how to play the piano. In 1979, his family would move again, this time to South Korea, because Mr. Savka was taking on a new job overseeing a nuclear reactor in that country. It was determined, though, that Williams should return to Canada and finish his high school degree there. He did, and he was enrolled at Upper Canada College, which is a boarding school, and it's widely believed to be Canada's most prestigious prep school. In his last year, he was chosen as a prefect for his boarding house, meaning that he was authorized to enforce discipline.
From there, William studied economics and political science at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, where ironically another prolific Canadian serial killer, Paul Bernardo, was actually studying at the same time, only 2 years ahead of Williams. Williams would graduate from UTSC with a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1986. In his time at UTSC, he developed a bit of a name for himself as a prankster. He would pick door locks and hide inside rooms for hours to shock and surprise the people who lived in them. This disturbing behavior is going to become more of a pattern when we get into his crimes. It appears that he had been preparing for many years.
After graduation, Williams joined the Canadian Forces in 1987, and he received his flying wings in 1990, and was then posted to 3 Canadian Forces Flying Training School, which is located in Portage-la Prairie, Manitoba. He worked there for 2 years as an instructor, and on January 1st of 1991, Williams was promoted to captain within the armed forces, and he was then posted to 434 Combat Squadron at Canadian Forces Base, or CFB, Shearwater, Nova Scotia. And then, in 1992, he was flying the CC-144 Challenger in the Electronic Warfare and Coastal Patrol role. He was certainly moving up within the armed forces, and he was doing so very quickly.
Not only was Williams moving up in the armed forces with great success, but he was also finding success in his personal life. On June 1st, 1991, he would get married to Mary Elizabeth Harriman, who to this day is still a lobbyist for the Heart and Stroke Foundation in Canada. At this point in his life, Williams also displayed a passion for hobbies, including photography, fishing, and jogging, even getting his wife involved by playing golf together.
In 1994, Williams continued his ascent, and he was posted to the 412 Transport Squadron in Ottawa, where he worked flying and transporting VIPs, including high-ranking officials from the Canadian government and foreign dignitaries who were coming into Canada. He was then further promoted to the rank of Major in November of 1999, and he was posted to Director General of Military Careers in Ottawa, where he served as the multi-engine pilot career manager.
Clearly working towards even more career advancement, Williams earned his Master of Defense Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada in 2004 with a 55-page thesis that supported preemptive war in Iraq. In June of 2004, he was then promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and in July was appointed to the commanding officer of the 437 Transport Squadron of CFB Trenton, and would hold that position for 2 years. From December of 2005 to May of 2006, he also served as the commanding officer of Camp Mirage, which was a secretive logistics facility that is believed to have been located at Al Minhad Air Base in Dubai, UAE. The facility provided support for Canadian forces in Afghanistan. Williams was ranked for top secret military clearance.
On July 21st of 2006, Williams was posted to the Directorate of Air Requirements, where he served as the project director for the Airlift Capabilities Project's Strategic and Tactical and Fixed-Wing Search and Rescue. He worked directly under Lieutenant General Angus Watt. With this promotion, Williams and his wife commissioned the building of a house and made the move to a suburb of Ottawa.
In January of 2009, again obviously in preparation for further advancement, Williams was sent to the Canadian Forces Language School in Gatineau, Quebec for 6 months to learn how to speak, write, read, and understand French. While he was there, he was promoted to colonel at the recommendation of Angus Watt. On July 15, 2009, when his stint at the school was completed, he was sworn in as the wing commander at CFB Trenton by the outgoing wing commander, Brigadier General Michael Hood. CFB Trenton, for those that don't know, is the biggest airbase in Canada and a hub for support for all overseas operations. This was a very highly esteemed position.
It should be noted that Williams was regarded as a model military officer for the entire course of his 23-year-long military career. This can be seen by the promotions and the way in which he climbed the military ladder. He had even flown foreign dignitaries like Queen Elizabeth II and the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, as well as the Governor General of Canada, the Prime Minister of Canada, and countless others from Canada and abroad over the years in Canadian Forces VIP aircrafts.
In January of 2010, though, everything changed in a moment, and the seemingly perfect second life that Williams had built and was living for many years fell like a house of cards. On January 28, 2010, Jessica Lloyd, a 27-year-old woman, disappeared from her home in Belleville, Ontario. Jessica was a known personality in the community, so it didn't take long for people to notice that she had gone missing. Once notified, the investigation began, and investigators discovered distinctive tire tracks that had been left in the snow along the north tree line of her property, which was about 100 meters north of her home. A week after she had disappeared, and having no other leads, the OPP made the decision to conduct an extensive canvassing effort of all motorists that used the highway near her home from 7 p.m. on February 4th until 6 a.m. the following morning. They were looking for the tires that had left the distinctive treads in the snow near Jessica's home.
On that day, Williams had passed through the checkpoints and he was driving a Nissan Pathfinder rather than the BMW that he usually drove. An officer immediately noticed the resemblance of his tires to the treads that were left by Jessica's home. Not long after he was there, his treads were confirmed to have been a match to the distinct treads that had been left behind the night that Jessica had gone missing.
On February 7th, just 3 days later, while at his newly built home, where his wife lived full-time and he lived part-time, he received a call from the Ottawa Police Services and was asked to come into their offices for questioning. There is little doubt that he knew at this point what he was being called in for, but he must have believed that he had all of the answers ready because he showed up without issue.
At 3 p.m. on February 7th of 2010, Williams was interrogated at police headquarters by OPP Detective Staff Sergeant James Smith. By 7:45 p.m., after having been presented with the tire tread evidence and also shoe impression evidence, which was also a match, he realized that he was linked to Jessica's disappearance, and Williams started to confess to his crimes. Investigators, though, could not have possibly known the scope of crimes that Williams was going to confess to. Jessica Lloyd's disappearance was the tip of a massive iceberg of crime that Williams had been hiding for many years.
He told investigators that he had in fact had a role in countless crimes, including multiple acts of breaking and entering and sexual assault in and around Tweed and Orleans, Ontario, at locations that were close to the properties that were owned by him and his wife. He also told police that they could find evidence hidden inside of his Ottawa home, including hidden keepsakes, photographs that he had taken of his victims and himself posing in their underwear, video files of his assaults, murders, and more. On February 8th, Williams took police to the place that he disposed of Jessica's body.
Mere hours after Williams had confessed and was arrested, police across the country were reopening homicide cases and sexual assault cases that had gone unsolved and that had involved young women in any of the areas where Williams had been stationed or lived, based on the statements that Williams gave to police. In addition to what would become 4 primary cases against Williams, 2 for murder and 2 for sexual assault, police investigated a total of 48 cases of theft of women's underwear that dated back to 2006.
Inside of his Ottawa home, police found stolen lingerie that was meticulously and neatly stored, cataloged, and concealed. This guy really was the Dexter of stealing women's underwear, it seemed.
Sadly, though, he didn't end up sticking with just underwear. As we see way too often, there was an escalation in crime here, and with Williams, it seemed like it came quickly and furiously.
A week after his arrest, investigators reported that along with those hidden keepsakes, they found a plethora of evidence that tied Williams to people, places, and crimes, like he admitted. As everything started to unravel, Williams clearly had time to think about all of the things that he had done, all of the people he had hurt. Having some alone time to think about these kind of things ultimately led him to trying to take his own life while inside of the Quinte Detention Center in Napanee, Ontario. He stuffed a cardboard toilet paper roll down his throat and lodged it there, hoping to choke. He was unsuccessful and placed under suicide watch.
Williams had been remanded into custody on February 8th of 2010, and on that date, the Canadian Forces announced that they would have an interim commander soon appointed to replace Williams, and they removed his biography from the Department of National Defense on February 9th. Williams was charged with murder in the case of Jessica Lloyd, and he was also charged with murder in the death of Corporal Marie-France Como, who was a 37-year-old military traffic technician who had been based at CFB Trenton and who had answered directly to Williams. She had been found dead inside of her home in late November of 2009. Williams was also charged with breaking and entering, forcible confinement, and the sexual assault of 2 other women in connection with 2 separate home invasions that took place near Tweed in September of 2009.
His earliest known crime was committed in September of 2007 when he started to break into the homes of neighbors in Tweed. His first victims were a family that lived just a few doors down from the cottage that the Williams had owned. The family were in fact friends with Williams and Mary, and he repaid that friendship by breaking into their home on 3 separate occasions, and on one occasion, he took photos of himself laying naked in bed and masturbating with a pair of red panties that belonged to the couple's 12-year-old daughter.
In 2008, Williams started to break into homes at a faster pace, and he would steal women's and girls' underwear. In one case, he actually stole 186 pieces of clothing from one home. He would often take photos of himself inside of the homes masturbating. He would take pictures of the bedroom, then the underwear that he was going to steal inside of the dresser, and then later on the bed. Often he would then model the underwear himself and masturbate with them. Some of the victims of theft were as young as 9 years old. Between September of 2007 and November of 2009, he committed a total of at least 82 break-ins of 48 different homes in the Tweed and Belleville areas of Ontario. Most of these crimes went undetected and thus went unreported. Williams shared that twice his collection had become so large that he had burned the undergarments in a field that was located in Ottawa.
It was in July of 2009 when Williams' crimes escalated. He hid outside a neighbor's home in Tweed and he waited for the young woman to get in the shower. It was around 1:30 a.m. and he stripped naked, broke into the home, went into the bathroom naked, and stole the underwear. In another incident at this time, he waited outside of the teenager's window for her to undress while he watched on, stripped naked outside, and masturbated to the sight of her.
By September of 2009, Williams decided that he needed more stimulation than just watching women undress and stealing their underwear, and that was when he made his first major escalation. Around 1 a.m. on September 17th of 2009, he dressed in all black, and he covered his face and entered the home of a 21-year-old woman near Tweed as she was sleeping. She was a young mom, and her baby was also sleeping nearby. Williams woke her up with a blow to the head and subdued her, and then struck her several times and bound her hands completely together. He then also covered her face with a pillow. The woman later told investigators that Williams had pulled aside her tank top, fondled her breasts, and took photographs of her naked, and then he had stolen some of her lingerie and a baby blanket and fled the scene.
Less than 2 weeks later, he would again escalate his crimes when he broke into the home of a 46-year-old woman who lived just a few doors away from him. She was a mother of 3 and was asleep on the couch when he broke in and began to punch her, and he wrapped her in a blanket to subdue her. He then tied her up, blindfolded her, and kept her under his control for 3.5 hours, during which time he fondled her breast, took pictures, and at one point pulled out a knife and cut her clothes off. That was the 3rd time that he had broken into that particular home. Neighbors, of course, talked in length of the attack, and in public, Williams told people that his wife was completely shaken by the attack, diverting the attention, and the neighborhood essentially had pointed the blame at another neighbor who was already ostracized by the people within it. Williams had believed that he had gotten away with it.
And then came the ultimate escalation. Williams had gone from theft and breaking and entering to sexual assault, and now needed more stimulation, and he committed his first murder. In November of 2009, Corporal Marie-France Como, who, as mentioned, was under Williams' command, was found dead inside of her home. Marie and Williams had only met on one prior occasion, but Williams admitted that he had watched her, and he knew that she lived alone with her 2 cats. Williams would break into her home, and again he took photographs of himself in her underwear, and then a week later he broke in once again and hid in Marie's home behind the furnace.
Marie would go through her house looking for her cats, and when she looked behind the furnace, she found Williams, masked and armed with a bag full of plastic zip ties, a camera, duct tape, and a flashlight, which he used to strike her with multiple times in the head to gain control. He then secured the home, dragged her upstairs, and assaulted and raped her for several hours as she pleaded with him to not take her life. Williams recorded the video of the entire ordeal. Marie asked him at the end of the attack if he was going to kill her, and she begged for him to have a heart and to let her live. Instead, he covered her nose and mouth with duct tape and suffocated her to death. He then took more photographs.
Before Williams left her home, he bleached her bedsheets. He covered her with a duvet, and he took some of her lingerie. It would be Marie's boyfriend who would find Marie's body, tragically. Ironically, on the same day as the murder, as a part of a United Way fundraiser, Williams had been cuffed and put into jail. Hauntingly, 1 week after the murder, it would be Williams, as the CFB commander, who would send a condolence letter to Marie's father, who was also a military veteran.
It appeared that Williams settled down for a short period of time after the murder of Marie, and whatever had been driving his urge for more stimulation subsided for a short time. It would be 3 months later, on January 28, 2010, when Jessica Lloyd disappeared. On January 27th, Williams had seen Jessica on a treadmill inside her home, and then the following day, he was in her backyard waiting for her to fall asleep, and when she did, he broke in.
Once he was inside of her bedroom, he bound her and forced her to model her lingerie for him as he took photographs and recorded video of the entire ordeal. He then proceeded to rape Jessica, and he took video of that as well. The assault lasted for hours, and then he forced her into his vehicle and drove her to his home in Tweed, where she had a seizure, and begged for Williams to take her to the hospital. Williams instead gave her some fruit and continued to assault her sexually and physically. Jessica, sensing that Williams was going to kill her, asked him to make sure that her mother knew that she loved him. 20 hours after the attack started, Williams played a sadistic prank on her and told her that he was going to take her home. He dressed Jessica and began to walk her away from his home as though he was indeed going to let her go, and then instead, he struck her in the head with a flashlight and then strangled her to death. The following day, he dumped her body.
This was a monster who was driven by something inside of him that was obviously pure evil. The escalation of these crimes and the severity that they jumped is certainly mind-blowing and disturbing.
What really jumps off the page for me is that he was clearly driven by control, even though in his military life he was a very powerful man. This was a man that was driven almost entirely by power and control, who truly already had it. Alpha males are generally not the types of people to be driven by such a motive. This was sexual, and it was about those things, power and control, especially with Jessica at the end. It blows my mind, and it's hard to wrap my mind around.
Williams appeared before the Ontario Court of Justice in Belleville via video link from the Quinte Detention Centre on July 22, 2010, and his second appearance via video link was set for August 22nd. Williams waived his right to a preliminary inquiry, and his next appearance was scheduled at the Ontario Superior Court of Justice on October 7, 2010, where his lawyers stated that Williams would plead guilty to all of the charges that had been filed against him.
On October 18th of 2010, Williams did plead guilty to all of the charges that were filed. On the first day of his trial and guilty plea, that was when the details started to emerge of all of the other crimes that Williams had committed. The first day of that trial also unveiled the fact that Williams did indeed have pedophilic tendencies.
It also came to light that using his own clearances, he had kept track of police reports that pertained to any of the crimes that he had committed, and he had logged his crimes, kept photographs and videos, and even had left notes and messages for his victims. For example, in a break and enter into the bedroom of a 12-year-old girl, he had left a message on her computer saying merci, which is thank you in French.
On October 22nd of 2010, Ontario's Superior Court Justice Robert F. Scott sentenced Williams to 2 concurrent terms of life in prison with no consideration for parole for 25 years. It's been stated many times since that there is very little chance that Williams will ever be paroled due to the nature and especially the escalation of his crimes.
After his conviction, the Governor General of Canada revoked Williams's commission and expelled him from the armed forces. He was stripped of the rank of colonel in the Air Force and all of his military decorations. He was allowed to keep his military pension, which is equal to $60,000 Canadian per year, though, because terminating that would require an act of parliament. After his uniform was returned to the armed forces, it was burned, his medals were cut into pieces, and his commission scroll was shredded. These actions are similar to the actions that are taken when someone commits military degradation.
At the end of 2010, his wife Mary began the steps of getting a divorce from Williams, and that process was only finalized years later. In 2004, Lori Massicott, one of the women who was sexually assaulted by Williams, claimed that Mary was aware of her husband's illicit conduct and that she had gained financially from that illicit conduct when she acquired her husband's assets when he was arrested and convicted. It should be noted that nobody in the case had ever stated that Mary was aware of anything, and for her part she denied those allegations and said that Lori had provided no evidence to support her claims and that she could not support those claims.
Williams was originally incarcerated at Kingston Penitentiary in the segregation unit, and then when Kingston Pen was set for closure, he was moved to Port Cartier Institution, a maximum security prison in Port Cartier, Quebec.
Well, I feel like I say this every time we sit down together, but what a crazy case. What should we talk about this before we put a bow on this episode, and why don't we start with the fact that this man is making more money per year with his military pension than I make working my ass off? How's that make you feel?
Yeah, that part doesn't sit well with me at all, considering everything that he did, everything that he admitted to. He's still receiving some sort of recognition positively, and he shouldn't be. And if they're going to go as far as to burn his uniform and treat him as basically shunned completely from the military, then why not also take the money that he was supposedly entitled to? You're only further just giving him more affirmation of everything.
Yeah, it's crazy. So like I was like, surely this has changed. It's everything says, oh, it would require an act of parliament. And it's like, okay, well, this was like 10 years ago. So I'm sure that over the years this has happened. So like I did an extensive search, and it's sad. Like, not only is he still receiving this pension, and not only is it held up by the fact that there's not a parliamentary order to take his pension away, but the only news stories that I could find on this were also from 2014. Like, no one's talking about this. And it's insane to me. So we did the tour of Kingston Penitentiary. And actually that was the first place I think that I heard that he's still receiving this military pension. And I was just like, this is insane to me. Now, when we were at Kingston Penitentiary, which is the place where he was originally incarcerated, we were able to see old signage that showed like how much things cost in prison. And it's nuts, okay? So there are things, like a bag of chips I think was like 75 cents. All kinds of snacks, chocolate bars, they were like way cheaper than we would pay on the outside. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense to an extent, because in prison you're obviously not getting paid a massive wage when you're doing work. But when you have $60,000 a year at your disposal, you could buy anything you want. Like, how is this guy, who is, I don't want to say a menace to society, but that doesn't even come close to covering it. Here's this disgusting human being, and he, like I said, he quite literally is making more money than I do. That's insane.
I completely agree, and it makes no sense for someone, especially behind bars, to be receiving any sort of monetary compensation for anything. Like, the part that really, really got me about this whole case was that the military went as far as to treat him as someone who degraded the military, who, it's like the highest disrespect in the world. And
the equivalent of like being caught as a spy or something of that nature.
Exactly. And they're just like, oh, well, let's continue to allow the taxpayers to pay his pension, even though he took the lives of multiple people while under the guise of being perfectly normal, while under the guise of being completely competent. And the other thing that really got me was that everyone said he wasn't a sociopath, but someone who could excel so easily and be in such a position of power and have a complete hidden life to the extent that he did, where it was countless crimes. It wasn't like one or two little break-ins and like one or two little assaults, like the pizza man delivered the pizza late and he was drunk and punched him in the face. These were premeditated attacks. These were plans. These were things that he actively worked on and actively tried. Like we mentioned before, he broke into people's units as a college student just to see their shock and reaction.
He worked his whole life. Like, we were talking about this off air before we started. He literally, he worked at this his whole life. You read like, oh, funny, haha, he pulled pranks on people, and he would pick their locks and hide inside of their dorm rooms waiting for them to come and scare them. It's like he built himself up. He was named as a prefect at his private school, which means he doled out punishment and he was in control. Then he went to the military. He got control and power, and then he exerted that over civilians because it wasn't enough. He had a complete lust for power, control, and a belief that he was essentially above the law. I said it. This guy flew with the prime minister, the queen. Like dignitaries from all over the world. This guy rubbed shoulders with people that like we couldn't even comprehend. And yet here he was with civilians, people that he knew, breaking into their homes, stealing their personal effects, sexually assaulting them, and then going out in the neighborhood and pointing the blame at other people. Like, we talked about that. Oh, the guy down the street that nobody likes, he's probably the person that did it. My wife was terrified. He not only was an active criminal, he was smart about it. He tried to cover his path. He knew how to throw shade. He knew how to fade it onto someone else all the time. And then you say the sociopath. I did read that a lot. Now, it was clinically stated he wasn't a psychopath. I'm with you. He was definitely a sociopath. How do you murder someone like he did with Marie and then write the sympathy letter to her father? How do you do that? That's insane.
It takes one sick person to do that.
Was there anything else that stood out about the case to you that you wanted to touch on?
No, I think that's everything. I'm disappointed in our system, and I really wish that, a parliamentary order would go through and that money would be taken away and potentially dedicated to the families or allocated to something better than allowing him to live behind bars.
I would assume that at least part of that money, I couldn't find it anywhere. I assume that at least part of that goes to his ex-wife. Like, that's just how that stuff works. But it's just like, no, like, this guy doesn't deserve to be paid with our tax dollars for the service, quote unquote, that he provided for this country when he was doing this as a second life. And I'm with you. Like, I actually want to kind of look into this and see if there's a way to start at least getting this out in the public eye again. I might as well make enemies with another serial killer. Why not, right?
Honestly, I think especially with Remembrance Day coming up, Veterans Day, everything like that, and even just the recognition of the fact that, like you said, this hasn't been spoken about since 2014. Clearly something has fallen through the cracks. And if this is just one case where we can actively see our taxpayers' money going to someone that genuinely doesn't deserve it, how many other cases are there out there? And I would really like to know if there is any way that we could potentially push through a parliamentary action where that is taken into account when someone who is a member of the military does anything wrong, that automatically gets triggered. And if it's at a certain extent and a certain level, then yes, they don't receive it. If they were drunk and did something wrong and they got suspended, like, sure, they get a little bit of compensation while they're suspended or whatever. But to go on a murderous spree, a violent rampage, and premeditated attacks and still get paid, I really think that that is something that needs to be considered the moment any one of these members who are supposed to be dedicated to protecting us and dedicated to, giving us some sort of confidence in our own government and the people that are in charge of, keeping us safe. That would really be something that, should be considered.
100%. And, like, this is one of those things, the last thing I wanted to mention is it's kind of crazy. Like, we read at the top of the episode about how he escalated and he got promoted through the military. And it's wild. Like, it almost coincides. It's like the more power he got within the military, the more he was driven by his sexual deviancies and everything else that was driving him. More power meant wanting more power. He wanted to exert more control over his victims. And I don't know, man, like, it shakes me to my core a little bit because it's like, usually you cover this case and it's someone who had an abusive upbringing. It's someone who had a hard life. It's someone who basically was lashing out about something. Here's a guy who, I don't care what you say, he was born with and lived with a silver spoon. Like, he went to the top prep school in this country. had the ability and did things that you and I could never dream of. There's not that kind of money. There's not that kind of pressure behind us. Nothing to help us in that way. This guy got everything you could ever ask for to be successful in life. And it wasn't enough.
I agree, and it's rather unfortunate, but it is what it is, and things need to change. It's going to take people like us and people who hear us to bring voices out and say that this is something that is not okay.
Yeah, and it's crazy. I mean, I don't know how you vet someone like this out. You know, people, he got everywhere he went. He had a clear record. He was the best. That's why he kept getting these promotions. He was sent away to military school to learn a new language so he could move further up the ladder. There was no warning signs. And then he walks in thinking he's got all the answers, and whatever the police have isn't going to implicate him. And 4.5 hours later, he spills the beans. It's something else. It's like literally the mask came off and everything just came out, and nobody had an inkling of it before.
Which surprises me. The wife not knowing anything, that really surprises me.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, Lori did bring it up in her case before the courts to try to say that, you know, I mean, there's no denying that Mary was gaining financially because of what happened with Williams, but you know, Williams never stated that his wife knew anything. The police, investigators, courts, lawyers, nobody ever said it. So I have to say I believe that she didn't. And part of the thing here is if you look, there is breaks in time between a lot of the crimes, or they would happen in clusters, or there would be a long pause. And we do know that they owned at least the two properties, one in Tweed and one in a suburb of Ottawa. And that in Ottawa is where Mary lived full time, and obviously being at the CFB, Williams lived in Tweed, and that was where the area where most of, if not all of his crimes were centralized. So you can understand how maybe Mary didn't know what was going on. It's still difficult, but you know, without proof, you don't know. But it's just, I don't understand. As someone who pretty much wears my emotions on my shoulders, I don't know how anybody could live such a double life.
Agreed. It's astonishing and brings me back to the whole definitely a sociopath.
Yep, I can't deny that. Well, as we approach Remembrance Day here in Canada, Veterans Day in the United States, and celebrate those that have fought for us all over the world, please remember, of course, that Russell Williams is certainly an outlier in a sea of selfless human beings who spent most of their lives looking out for us and what they believe to be the betterment of society as a whole. I find myself wanting to also say to remember that even people that appear to be good people, though, can certainly be bad people. Certainly always keep your guard up and always be diligent and wary of those around you. Jump on social media, jump over to the Patreon page for the podcast, as there are special exclusives popping up all the time. Join in the conversation, support the show if you enjoy it. It certainly helps me to keep it going with any support that you can muster. Thank you for again listening. Thank you to Bailey for doing 2 episodes with me, and I hope that all of you are being well and being better. I'll see you next time on Gone But Never Forgotten.